Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of Hot Cocoa. In this episode, we'll be looking at a class called NSWorkspace, which is a very useful class, and it gives you access to a bunch of different things that you may need to do relating to how your app interfaces with other apps. Using NSWorkspace, you can do things like open files in other applications, open other applications themselves. It's how you open a URL in the default web browser. You can get a list of the running applications. In Snow Leopard, you can set the background using it. And you can also get information about the files on the system from the file system. For example, the date modified or something like that. So let's begin by creating a new project. And let's call this one Workspace. Just a regular application here. So, as always, first thing we do is set up our declarations here in the header. For this particular application, we're going to need 2 outlets and 4 actions. So, for our outlets, they're both NS text fields. One of them is the file URL, and the other one is a web URL for opening a web page. Now for the 4 actions, we're going to need one for opening applications, and for the sake of expediency, I'm just going to copy and paste this one and then change the names. So our second one is going to be opening a file. Then we'll need one for opening a URL. And then finally one for listing the running applications. So we can go ahead and save that, and now that we have that, let's go and create our interface real quick. So for this, as you can see from the header file, we just need 2 NS text fields. Like so. Doesn't really need to be perfectly neat since we're just doing this to demonstrate a purpose. Or in this case, to demonstrate a method. And we'll need 4 buttons. Just grab them here. I can just copy and paste one of them. There we go. So we'll have one of them for opening a file, one of them for opening a URL, one of them for listing the applications, and finally, one of them for, in this case, we're going to be opening Safari, because it's one thing that I can be sure that's on everybody's system. But really, you can use what I'm about to show you for opening any application that's in the application folder. So let's go ahead and link these up here. Save that. Quit. And let's switch over to our main source file here. Copy and paste those. To avoid extra work retyping them, avoiding extra work at all costs is a good work method. Alright, so for opening the application, first thing we need to do is actually get access to the workspace. There's one shared workspace per application, and so you don't need to create your own NSWorkspace object. You can if you want to, because it's quicker than otherwise typing it. So in order to do that, you would just create an NSWorkspace object. We'll call that WS, and just set that equal to NSWorkspace, shared workspace. Now this is really more of a placeholder than actually creating a new object, because, like I said, there's only one shared workspace for your application. So anytime you do anything within this workspace, you're going to be using that same object. So doing this really just creates a shortcut where instead of typing in a workspace, shared workspace every time, you only have to type WS. So for launching an application, this will return a Boolean, which will tell us whether or not the application launched. So we'll call that was launched. And to get to that, we simply use the NSWorkspace method launch application and just give it an NS string with whatever application you want to open, which in this case we'll be using Safari. And then you can check to see whether or not it was launched. And we'll just write something to the NS log if it was. Apparently it doesn't scroll up automatically when it goes off the end of the screen. Right. Now it's important to note that just because was launched returns true, that does not mean that the application has finished launching. Was launched could be true, and it means that it did successfully launch, but then the application could still be loading. So don't rely on that as a reliable indicator of whether an application is running, because it may not have finished launching, even if that returns true. You can check that by using the list applications method, which I'm going to show you in a bit, and that will tell you whether or not it's actually running. So for open file, again, I'm going to copy and paste this just to save time. So for that, all you need to do is use the open file method for NSWorkspace. And that simply takes an NS string with the file path. So we'll give it the file URL, give it the string value from that NS text box. It may be sort of odd to be calling it a file URL, because typically when you think of URLs, you think of the web, but it would seem more and more OS X is moving towards using URLs for the location of any file, regardless of whether it's online or on your computer. In this case, it's still just using a string value, but you'll see for the OpenURL example how you can pass it in as URL if at some point they decide they want a URL for the path instead of just a string value. So for the OpenURL, again, get access to the workspace there, and obviously enough, we'll use the open URL there. But for this, I'm just going to use that as a little placeholder there. For this, we actually need to take the string from our NS text field and turn it into a NS URL, because it won't work if we just send it a string, which in order to do that, we just create a new NS URL object and use NS URL method URL with string, and pass that the web URL instead of giving it directly to NSWorkspace. So we'll give that its string value, like so. So we now have our URL, putting it in an NS URL object, and then passing that along to our shared workspace. Close that off. And finally, our list applications one, which is a bit different in that we're actually going to be passing it a key value coding string that tells it what we want to get from the apps. And for that, it's going to return an NS array. So let's just set up an array right now. And we'll pass that along to our NS array, and we'll be using, paste that up there. We will be using the value for key path method, and the key path we will be sending it is launched applications, and for each launched applications we want to get the NS application name, like so, and then we can print that out to the log like that. Now I feel I should probably point out that in the documentation it says that if you were creating an application that's targeted specifically towards Snow Leopard, you should, instead of using launched applications, you should use NS running applications instead, which returns a more detailed information about each application. For this case, launched applications just returns an array of NS strings with the name of the application in it. What running applications does is that it'll return an array of NS running application objects, and then from each of those objects, you can go and get information about that specific application. It's not been deprecated per se, so it's not bad coding practice, I guess, to use launched applications in Snow Leopard, especially if you want your thing to run on Leopard also. But they recommend that if you're targeting for Snow Leopard specifically, that it's better to use NS running applications. So let me change that colon to a semicolon so our code actually correctly functions. We'll save that and see if we can run it without any build errors. Haven't had a lot of luck with running without build errors from the first two episodes. What went wrong this time? Yep, missed a semicolon. I'd like to note that the first time I recorded this episode, and I had to scrap it because I had the resolution set wrong on the computer, it did run without any build errors. So, for the record, I got it to run runs without any typos or anything. So, fix that, and let's try running it again. Hey, it works. So let's try opening Safari, see if that works. It does. There's Safari. Close out Safari, and incidentally we'll be opening Safari again. So let's try going to hotcocoa.tv, click open URL, and Safari opens our nice brown website there. And I would note that it will, using OpenURL will open it in whatever the default browser is. In this case, this just happens to be Safari, which we also used for the launch application demo, but it'll open in Firefox or Chrome or whatever the default browser is set to. All right, let's try opening a file here. See if we can find a good file to open. All right, let's open our little gzip wrapper zip that we created. Open file, it'll open in the archive utility, and there we go. You can see I've done this before, but you can see it creates a folder like it normally does. If you use just the open file method, then it will open it in whatever the default application for that file type is. There's also the open file with application method, which allows you to specify a particular application to open it with. And then finally our list applications, which for that I need to open the log so we can see that it's actually doing something. You can see, yes, Safari did open. So click list applications, and you can see those are all the currently running applications. So hopefully this will give you a good idea of how you can use NSWorkspace in your applications. There's a lot more that it can do. Some of the things I listed in the intro, those are all in the documentations, and they're all accessed pretty much the same way. You can either if you can also access it like this, the long way, like that, instead of creating your own sort of object of it, which just references the main one. So you can look in the documentation for other things you can do with it. I would recommend looking at the there's a demo project that Apple created called I believe it's iSpend, which is sort of a core data financial management type application. Personally, I think it demonstrates more than it needs to, as do most of their applications. They go, instead of providing specific answers to specific things, they go and create one application that demonstrates like 50 different things. But nevertheless, it's a good application to look at to see the different things you can do with NSWorkspace. There's also one on there that will show you how to change the desktop background from within your program. It is, however, important to note that only exists on Snow Leopard or higher. So if you put that in your application, it'll only work on Snow Leopard. I don't know if there's a way to programmatically set the background in Leopard, because normally you just want to let the user use system preferences to set the background. But there are instances where you would want to do it programmatically. For example, a web browser. If you right-click on an image in a web browser, it's always nice to have an option there to set the background, unlike Chrome, which doesn't have that. So I'm calling them out on that because I wish it did. Anyway, that concludes this episode of Hot Cocoa. I will see you next time.